Wednesday morning, everybody. Welcome into today's episode of FreightWaves Now. I'm Kaylee Nix here with Anthony Smith.
That's right. And on this Wednesday edition, we get to talk to Next Trucking Mike Bush about the effects of tighter independent regulations and impacts on shippers. We'll also get to talk about or have our roundtable recapping the ATA conference. But first, we have to get to our top story, which deals to the infrastructure and airports, and if it's up to the task of modern freight loads and patterns. Joining us on this air is our air cargo editor, Eric Coolidge. Eric, thanks so much for being here this morning.
Good morning, Anthony. Thanks a lot.
Eric, it's good to have you in here today to talk a little bit about this really interesting topic, especially when we look at all of these airports wanting to do these projects, but maybe not necessarily having the funding to do them. Right now, as we sit or where we sit with the way that our current airports are set up, are they equipped to handle what's going on with their cargo sectors, or do they need a little bit of help?
Yeah, the airports do need a little bit of help, or a lot of help. Oops, sorry, one of my lights went out. Can you see me? The airports have primarily focused on passengers a lot, over the years, and cargo has been kind of like the stepchild, the way it's been treated as far as, getting resources and space and so forth. And so over the years, the airport authorities have just gravitated that way, but there's this enormous amount of neglect or demand for modernization over the years, because the cargo flows have just been increasing over time, and then during the pandemic the cargo exploded, and the way the cargo came in on freighters rather than piecemeal and passenger planes, or kind of spread out, just overwhelmed a lot of these cargo facilities that were really built, a lot of them 30, 40, 50 plus years ago, and just are, too tight, cramped, don't have, high ceilings so you can, stack or have multi-floor, container staging and so forth. So there's just been this, this demand. And so the Air Forwarders Association, which represents, logistics companies, and National Customs Brokers Association, did a white paper saying, there's this crying demand for airport modernization, and the amount of money in the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure bill that Biden got passed last year, calls for about $25 billion for airports. But the fear is, most of that's going to just go to passenger terminals and concession stands and parking for travelers. And so they want to set up a fund. The states and federal governments have set up state funds with about $3 to $5 billion targeted specifically to cargo. So, that's kind of the impetus for all this.
And Eric, you mentioned it a little bit earlier, really around the pandemic. How much did the pandemic really shift things to where we are right now, and what did it really kind of drive? Was it all really throughout the demand from e-commerce and things like that, or were there other underlying factors that were really an issue before the pandemic even started?
Yeah, well, I think the underlying issues had been there, and it was just exacerbated because, at major gateways like JFK in New York and O'Hare in Chicago and LAX and some others, there's periodically been a lot of backlogs, especially on the truck side, with trying to get into these docks, loading docks, or waiting for your cargo because the ground handlers can't sort through it quickly enough, or the truckers don't have technology with appointment systems, and you don't have good staging areas or turnaround areas or enough dock bays because the road geometry wasn't designed for big 53-foot trucks. So that's just been a longstanding issue, and then customs, whether there's enough customs people or customs, clearance facilities or personnel to clear stuff quickly. So, those have been ongoing issues. And so then the pandemic happened and it exacerbated it. And you saw some, cargo airlines and freight forwarders kind of migrate more to some of these secondary airports that we've talked about, such as Rockford, Illinois, or Greenville, Spartanburg, or Rickenbacker Airport near Columbus, where they don't have the congestion problems, or they're more focused on where cargo kind of gets priority, and you can clear something straight off a plane, right onto a truck and go within an hour or so. So it's just been kind of a building situation, and a lot of airports, these reports of the airports and the airlines don't really have that much, free cash right now to invest themselves, because these are huge projects to modernize a lot of these areas. And the pandemic, the airports lost billions of dollars. They weren't taking in money during the pandemic. Airlines similarly are finally getting back to break even, but they don't have a lot of reserves for helping to support cargo infrastructure. So they need these subsidies from the government, they say.
Eric, a lot of these areas in transportation are ripe for automation. And I'm wondering if there's any space for automation to start to roll into some of these operations, and the cargo operations at airports specifically. Typically, airports, when you think of cargo, you think of a lot of moving parts, a lot of human need to really keep up with what's going on in those decision-making processes. But is there any space now where you could see maybe some robotics start to see relevancy in the air cargo space?
Yeah, definitely. That's a good question. And I think, the report basically, said that that's part of the infrastructure upgrades that you'll see, or that are needed, technology-wise. I mean, nowadays, some of the big projects are being funded or being done as, public-private partnerships, where a private developer comes in and builds. And so they might put in some kinds of technology, but still, ideally it would be good to have a similar technology across the cargo landscape at an airport, not different ones at each facility. And maybe the airport authority could be the mediator on helping decide, set the standards or decide which technology, and these funds could help pay for it. So I think that's the idea, that there's not enough land at these airports to really expand at most of them. They're landlocked or constrained, so you either have to expand up, or you have to get more throughput through technology and having higher stacking or higher ceilings and so forth, and then using technology and robots to go get those containers.
And Eric, when we look at all these shifts and changes that are needed within the infrastructure, is this going to be possible without any kind of aid or assistance from government, local governments, federal government, anything like that? Or are these airports going to be able to kind of do this on their own, or do you see that there's going to be any kind of need for aid here?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I mean, I think, airports are starting to realize even more, or turn back to, after kind of a long period of where there wasn't that much investment in cargo, you're seeing some big projects. Philadelphia really wants to become a major player in cargo and has some strategic plans in place. JFK is doing some smaller projects, in LAX, as we talked about here, has a huge 15-year plan to redo its whole cargo, all the cargo buildings. That could be hundreds of millions of dollars to do. But and so airports are trying to fund these things on their own. But the Air Forwarders report basically says it'll just take a lot longer without some government help if we don't get it, and then you'll have kind of impacts on the local economy, because you won't have as many job hirings, and the cargo will have more congestion, so you'll have more supply chain gridlock. So it might get done eventually, but if you really want the economy, local economies to hum and things to work well and support businesses, these kind of subsidies that kind of seed money for the private sector and the local airports, that money is needed.
And that seed money is interesting for sure. Eric, we know obviously it feels like the air cargo sector is slowing a little bit as people get a little bit more options to ship their freight elsewhere. But a lot of this funding, a lot of the funding that would support the public-private partnership projects at airports, you say that 3 times fast, it's hard to do, is a lot of that reliant still on this intense need for air cargo? And if we see a little bit, or see the continued backing off, do we risk seeing the loss of some of those funds as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the consensus thinking is that, we're going to have a recession, cargo is tapering off, but that's temporary, right? It's not going to be the worst recession in the world. And then, we're back to it. And cargo is projected by a lot of analysts to continue growing at, about a 4% compound annual growth rate. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is when you just keep adding it up. And then you've got e-commerce, which is, growing, is slowing down now too. But if you go back to its recent growth rates of, 15% a year, that's a lot of growth. And e-commerce needs to be handled differently. You can't just put e-commerce into a general warehouse or cross dock like big pallets. It's broken down and sorted differently, has to go faster. So you need some different infrastructure, different facilities for that. And most airports are nowhere near equipped for that because e-commerce wasn't around 20, 30 years ago.
Eric, insightful as always. Thank you so much for being on this morning. If people want to get in touch with you or find more of your stuff, how can they do that?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Eric Reports and on LinkedIn, and you can find me at the bottom of my stories, my email or a link there.
All right, Eric, thank you for that. And of course, check out his stuff up on American Shipper as well. Right now, we're going to head on over to the wall. We've got our first carrier update this morning with Tony Mulvey and Donnie Gilbert.